Sacks, what do you think about inflation?
Okay, there was a really interesting chart on inflation that actually Zero Hedge tweeted, and I threw it up in the notes here, where they said real hourly earnings are negative 1.7%. It's the 10th month in a row where U.S. incomes aren't keeping up with inflation. So the problem here is that, people's incomes have increased with inflation, but not as much as the inflation rate. So the net effect of it is that people are feeling worse off. When they go to the grocery store to buy groceries or whatever they need, they don't feel as rich. That's the fundamental problem here. And I think there's a lot of people out there who think that there's a free lunch, that if we printed $2 trillion worth of stimmy checks, this was that $2 trillion bill last year that they shoveled through. I think the idea was we're going to print as much money as we can before the election, and it's going to help us in the midterms. Actually, as it turns out, it boosted inflation so much that people are feeling worse off, even though their wages went up slightly, because on a net basis, their earnings are down. So I just think it's a good reminder that you can't just print wealth. You can't print your way to prosperity.
No free lunches?
There's no free lunches.
Yeah.
Or we're going to create addiction to universal income or universal subsidy. That's the alternative, is people are going to basically try and vote to make some programs that were initially meant to be temporary more permanent in order to keep up the lifestyle that they've become accustomed to.
Just to build on Sax's point, the University of Michigan Consumer Sentiment was released, I think it was this morning, and it shows exactly what he's saying, which is that, consumers' propensity and confidence in the economy has been falling off a cliff. The month-over-month change was it was down 8.2%. The year-over-year change is down almost 20%. Current economic conditions was down 20%, and then index of consumer expectations down 19%. So to Sax's point,
people are scared.
Yeah, well, we've been talking on the show for the last, I'd say, a couple of months about balancing the risk of recession versus the risk of inflation. Inflation, I think, has gotten slightly worse. The print went from, the last print was 7.1%, now it's 7.5%. So to Chamath's point earlier, it's getting worse, but the rate of how fast it's getting worse is slowing.
Could be peaking.
But the risk of recession, I think, is increasing, because what's keeping this economy going is the consumer. And if the consumer sentiment now all of a sudden is tanking and people feel poor because of inflation, I just, now the risks are starting to become more balanced.
As sentiment goes down, this is where governors play a critical role, because if they don't open up these economies, we can't actually have a consumer-led consumption rebound of the economy, because there aren't any services to buy, because you can't actually be around anybody. So if the economy remains effectively closed and people are done buying, tubs of margarine and toilet paper, because, Armageddon isn't coming as we were worried it would, what are we supposed to be doing? So this is how these things interplay. So we have to get these, again, going back to where we started, we have to get this economy open, and we have to just get back to some sense of normalcy, and the consumer will lead us out. But I think, Sacks, you're right. On the margin, I think the risk is towards a recession, because people don't see this. Thomas Sowell, who's a well-known Stanford, I think he's a senior fellow at Hoover. He has this comment, which is effectively, taxes are bad for the rich and the poor, but inflation is bad just for the poor. And the reason he says that is because, if you're wealthy, you can transition to assets that are sort of inflation adjusted or inflation protected, right? You can consume assets, or you can purchase assets to protect yourself. But inflation is an exceptionally regressive means of the government taking compensation away from you, current compensation, and it disproportionately affects working class, ordinary people. And so if you have real wages that are negative, inflation that's high, that's confiscatory, right? You are meaningfully less well off than you were before. And, the wealthy folks have a way to hedge, but normal, ordinary working class people do not. And on the margin, then, if they then do not go out and spend, the problem will be some sort of recessionary effect.